Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're stepping right into the chaotic, smoke-filled final days of World War II to shatter a pretty stubborn historical myth. You know, we often look back at the deadliest conflict in human history, and we tend to view its conclusion as totally inevitable, right? Just smooth cause and effect. The collective memory basically goes, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs, and Japan immediately surrendered. But the truth? Well, the truth is a terrifyingly fragile story of political paralysis, midnight assassinations, massive geopolitical shockwaves, and honestly, absurd human error. The fate of millions literally hung by a thread at almost every single moment.
So let's picture this. It's the summer of 1945. The Japanese Empire is absolutely suffocating. The once mighty Imperial Japanese Navy is practically paralyzed in port, completely out of fuel. You've got an ironclad American submarine blockade and relentless aerial mining that have totally severed the home islands from food and steel. But despite this catastrophic economic and military impasse, the Japanese High Command, they aren't getting ready to yield. No, they're gearing up for an apocalyptic final stand.
In July 1945, the Allied powers delivered the Potsdam Declaration. This was a stark ultimatum demanding unconditional surrender and promising, quote, prompt and utter destruction. But how did Japan's leadership react to this? With a fatal, highly calculated silence. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki invoked this concept of mokusatsu, which literally means killing it with silence. He was desperately trying to manage the hardliners in his own cabinet while buying some time. The military high command looked at the horrific firebombing campaigns that had already reduced cities like Tokyo to ash, and they figured they could just outlast American resolve. If they made the coming ground invasion bloody enough, they truly believed the Allies would lose their appetite for war and eventually offer a negotiated peace.
And they planned to guarantee that bloodbath through a defensive strategy known as Ketsugo. 1 million. Just let that staggering number sink in for a second. That was the estimated total casualties of an Allied invasion. American battle doctrine usually dictated a 3-to-1 advantage for victory, but on the beaches of Kyushu, Japan massed their forces to create a terrifying 1-to-1 ratio of defenders to invaders. And we aren't just talking about trained soldiers here. They mobilized millions of civilians, women, children, the elderly, literally handing them wooden spears, small knives, and carpenter's awls. Men were being trained to roll under American tanks clutching live hand grenades. This wasn't just a military defense plan, it was culturally engineered national suicide.
Now, take a look at this incredibly compressed ticking clock. In August 1945, history didn't escalate by the month or the week. It escalated by the hour. We're going to walk through this terrifyingly narrow window together, because the forces of geopolitics, groundbreaking technology, and human psychology are about to violently collide.
On the morning of August 6th, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay unleashes a blinding flash of atomic destruction over Hiroshima. The physical and psychological devastation was entirely unprecedented in human history. Yet remarkably, Japan's ruling military elite didn't surrender. Why? Well, they actually applied their own desperate economic logic to an irrational technological leap. Knowing the sheer amount of vast resources that nuclear research required, they gambled that even if America had actually built an atomic bomb, they couldn't possibly possess more than one. So they absorbed the unimaginable blow and just prepared to keep fighting.
But then the geopolitical floor completely caved in. For months, Tokyo had been harboring this desperate, persistent delusion that Moscow would act as a neutral mediator to help them negotiate a peace treaty with the Americans. Instead, Joseph Stalin saw a massive opportunistic opening. On August 8th, more than 1 million Soviet Red Army troops poured across the border into Japanese-occupied Manchuria, instantly shattering a 1941 non-aggression pact. In one swift, armored thrust, Stalin completely obliterated Japan's entire diplomatic endgame.
So here is a crucial point. This massive Soviet invasion arguably dealt a greater political and strategic shock to the Japanese military than the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. Think about it. It completely severed communications with their armies in China, it stripped them of their primary sources of raw materials on the mainland, it even thwarted their last-ditch nightmare scenario. Their stockpiles of biological weapons in Manchuria under the notorious Unit 731, which they were now totally unable to deploy. Almost overnight, Japan was left entirely bankrupted, both militarily and diplomatically.
And literally just hours after the Japanese High Command fully grasped the reality of that Soviet betrayal, a second blinding flash occurs. On August 9th, a plutonium bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Now, the sheer chance involved here is staggering. Heavy smoke actually obscured the primary target of Kokura, forcing the bomber to pivot at the last minute. The bomb ultimately missed its mark in Nagasaki by nearly a mile, detonating in a valley that ended up shielding part of the city. But the strategic message? It was absolutely terrifying and unequivocal. The American nuclear arsenal was definitely not empty.
So, despite the twin, world-ending shocks of atomic devastation and Soviet betrayal, you would think surrender was an obvious choice, right? It wasn't. Deep inside a stifling underground bunker, Japan's Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, the Big Six, were violently deadlocked. 3 members, the peace faction, wanted to accept the Potsdam Declaration with just one single condition, retaining the emperor and the national polity, known as the Kokutai. But the other 3, the hardline military faction, were basically living in an alternate reality. They demanded 4 conditions: no Allied occupation of Japan, the right to conduct their own war crimes trials, and the right to handle their own disarmament. They were completely hopelessly paralyzed.
This total governmental paralysis forced an unprecedented midnight intervention on August 9th. Emperor Hirohito, a man considered a living deity who is constitutionally required to remain silent while his ministers debated, was actually asked by the prime minister to decide. At 2 a.m., in pin-drop silence, the emperor did the unthinkable. He removed a white glove, wiped his brow, and broke his centuries-old constitutional silence. Delivering the voice of the crane, he stated that to continue the war meant the total destruction of the nation, and he commanded them to accept peace.
But, incredibly, the military did not quietly obey their divine emperor. To the ultranationalists, the very idea of surrender was literally worse than national suicide. And so, on the stifling night of August 14th, mere hours before the emperor was scheduled to broadcast his surrender to the Japanese people, ultranationalist officers led by Major Kenji Hatanaka staged a violent midnight coup d'état, the Kyujo incident. Striking in the dark, they actually seized control of the imperial palace.
The proximity to total collapse here is absolutely terrifying. Rogue officers brutally murdered Lieutenant General Takeshi Mori when he refused to join their treason. They dispatched death squads out into the city to hunt down the prime minister. And right there, in the pitch-black labyrinth of the imperial palace, rebel soldiers frantically ransacked rooms hunting for the fragile phonograph records that contained the emperor's pre-recorded surrender speech. If they had found those records, the broadcast never would have happened, the war would have continued, and countless more lives would have vanished.
Fortunately, the coup failed. The conspirators just couldn't rally the wider army to their cause, and the leaders ultimately committed ritual suicide. At noon on August 15, 1945, those surviving phonograph records were finally played over the radio. For the very first time in history, a stunned Japanese nation heard the actual voice of their emperor. But in a final, incredible twist of cultural distance, Hirohito spoke in a highly archaic court dialect that most commoners couldn't even understand. And astonishingly, in officially accepting the Potsdam Declaration, he never once actually uttered the words surrender.
The war officially culminated a few weeks later on September 2, 1945, in a highly choreographed 23-minute ceremony in Tokyo Bay aboard the battleship USS Missouri. It was a masterclass in visual theater and geopolitical symbolism. Tucked right in the background, the Allies hung the fragile 1853 flag of Commodore Perry, the very American who first opened Japan to the West. And in a fascinating little detail of massive orchestration, that flag was actually displayed backward, showing its protective backing.
Now, the grandeur of this whole geopolitical theater was anchored by some deeply intimate human moments. General Douglas MacArthur presided over the signing. When he signed the instrument of surrender, he used 6 different pens. In an incredibly emotional gesture, he handed the first 2 to American General Jonathan Wainwright and British General Arthur Percival, 2 men who had just been released from years of brutal starvation in Japanese prisoner of war camps. It was this flawless projection of Allied triumph and justice.
Or, well, it was almost flawless. Because, as we know, history's made by human beings, and human beings make mistakes. When it came time for the Allies to sign the Japanese copy of the treaty, Colonel Lawrence Cosgrave, representing Canada, stepped forward. Cosgrave, a World War I veteran, was actually blind in one eye. In a tense historical accident that honestly borders on dark comedy, he accidentally signed his name on the line reserved for France. General Leclerc of France noticed this, but rather than cause a huge scene, he just signed on the Netherlands line. The Dutch then signed on New Zealand's line. By the time the poor New Zealand delegate approached, he had absolutely no designated line left and had to squeeze his name into the blank bottom margin.
When the Japanese delegation inspected their copy of the surrender document, they were absolutely horrified. To them, a mismatched, blemished diplomatic document was highly irregular and technically invalid. They stood up and vehemently protested, literally threatening to halt the entire conclusion of the war right there on the deck. General MacArthur's brusque chief of staff, General Richard Sutherland, had to step in. In a wildly unceremonious fix to the single most important document of the 20th century, he just aggressively crossed out the printed names with a pen, scribbled his initials next to the correct ones, and shoved it back at the Japanese to force them to accept it.
So as you take away all these extraordinary human details, I really want you to ask yourself, was this history truly inevitable? The end of the Second World War wasn't just a matter of dropping a bomb and signing a piece of paper. It required a geopolitical betrayal by the Soviets. It required a living god to break the rules of his own constitution. It survived a violent midnight coup in a darkened palace by mere inches, and it was almost derailed by a visually impaired diplomat signing on the wrong line. History is never a straight line, guys. It is a fragile, unpredictable collision of human choices, intense psychology, and pure chance. The outcome was never certain, not until the very last drop of ink dried.